Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the second in a series of webinars on strategic risk simulation, reshoring from China, investigating changes in trade routes. With our guest speakers, Chris White from scmBOX and Greg Schlegel from the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. We hope you enjoy the webinar today and look forward to your feedback on questions throughout the webinar and participating in our polling. Please log in to Poll Everywhere and Jim DeVries 073. It's in the chat. So again, thanks for joining us today. We hope that your family are healthy and safe. And this is the second in the series of webinars. Our first webinar focused on the strategic risk paradox with modeling and simulation. We looked at a couple use cases there of going from one supplier to two suppliers and the impact. Today, we'll build out from that with the strategic risk simulation, reshoring from China, looking into your second tier of your supply chain. Next webinar, we'll get into the financial health of your suppliers. What happens if your supplier goes south, down 1 to 3 tiers? And then we'll get deep into the tiers of your supply chain. And we are all dependent on these minerals. So there's a lot of civil conflict surrounding these minerals. So we'll get into that in August. And then we'll get into what happens if you move your manufacturing to India. What are some of the implications there? And some strategic risk scenario case study from that perspective. And then we'll go back to looking at the chip manufacturing that's going live now in the US and the impact of changing from our dependence on Taiwan. So with that, we're going to go back to the webinar and we look forward to, again, your feedback. You can join the pollev.com/Jim DeVries 073, and that's contained within the chat. My name is Jim DeVries, founder and partner of Enhance International Group. I will be today's host. Today, we're featuring EIG Partners, the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium, and scmBOX. First, short introduction from Chris and Greg. Chris, a few words.
Let's see. I'll jump to personal stuff. Everyone's got plenty of professional stuff, and I'll talk about some of mine in a little bit here. But I know, I think if anyone was in the last webinar, I said I like movies. I'm a movie buff, and I'm going to even funnel that down further. I can't remember if I mentioned it last time, but Will Ferrell movies. If he's in a movie, I'm watching it. And there have been a couple of times when I've been with my wife in the movie theater watching the movie, and she gets up and leaves. She can't handle it, and I'm rolling on the floor laughing. And so anyway, I'm a diehard Will Ferrell fan.
Awesome. Well, I'll just build on that impromptu. My favorite actor probably for many years was Jack Nicholson. I guess I liked a little bit more intense movies. Maybe I need to relax a bit, but he's got a few pretty interesting movies. But with that, Greg is not here, but he will be showing up soon, we hope.
Pleasure to be here with you via phone. I'm the founder of and CEO of a company called Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. I've taught supply chain management and risk at 6 universities. I'm a trained modeler, former IBMer, and past president of Apex organization. So great to be here. Sorry for the audio.
Thanks, Greg. We'll just move on to the deliverables today. We're going to kick some of the deliverables include insights and notable supply chain trade route changes, the financial impact of reshoring into your bottom line. Chris will bring us through a case study on that. Modeling long-term strategic risks to drive decision making, and then proactive action planning that you can do to address these trade route changes, which are contained within the simulation that Chris will provide in a few minutes. Really, the bottom line of this webinar is modeling the long-term financial impact of strategic risk events, and we're using the reshoring of China as that proxy to go through that. With that, Greg, a few words of introduction for the consortium?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. If you're looking at the consortium slide,
Yeah.
that's all good. We're about 32 companies, about 1,700 risk pros around the globe. We operate in 23 countries. If you look on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see 3 pillars. We do a lot of education, workshops. We do consulting where we lead, guide, direct, and coach. And we have a host of heavy-duty software as a service types of organizations, cloud-based companies who do the heavy lifting if you get into global supply chain risk management. On the left-hand side, we think about 5 product lines. We have online education. We have 2 certificate courses, self-paced on supply chain risk and resiliency. One is basic and one is public healthcare. We do a lot of work in public healthcare at the moment. We do a lot of coaching. We have the heavy-duty cloud-based solutions. And then we also have 2 online assessments. One is supply chain management readiness assessment, which we'll talk about today. And the other is a brand new online 90-day action plan geared specifically towards supply chain risk and resiliency. Back to you, Jim.
Thanks, Greg. Moving on to an overview on scmBOX.
Yeah, since everyone will see some of this in action, I won't talk too much about it, but scmBOX, supply chain management blocks, is a structural simulation software applied to supply chains. And we'll learn a little bit more about what that means, but it allows going deep tiers into the supply chain so you can see how the supply chain as an overall system acts and reacts and responds and recovers from whatever happens in that system. So we'll be using this today when you see the simulations.
Thanks, Chris. Fantastic technology here that Chris has developed over the last 20 years using funding from DARPA, Air Force, and the Army. Thanks, Chris. A little bit on the Enhanced International Group. We are a group of 50 plus companies with that common goal and thread to provide you the resources that you need to help you from strategy education, strategy to execution, I should say. Of course, today we're talking about taking action in strategy at the strategic level that affects your execution. So it's a very interesting concept of linking simulation to action from a strategic perspective. It's not a topic that is normally covered. And yet, when we sit in the boardrooms, we talk about what if this event happens, what impact could it have on us, and what should the actions be. You have business continuity planning, you have different things, but actually what's going to hit the bottom line from a CFO perspective, this is the first of a kind tool to help you in that analysis. So this can really be used across the board. So I'm very excited about this webinar. Excuse me. And our agenda today is to talk about strategic risk challenges and manufacturing sourcing in China and the risks of that. Then we'll get into the impact on global trade maps are obviously being redrawn due to the supply chains getting longer and more convoluted. We see that every day as the geopolitical tensions rise up with many different things going on to ignite that. Then we'll get into the relationship modeling, the impact of reshoring, the case study with Chris, some recommendations coming off of that, and then into how to get started. So we're going to open it up with a bit of discussion between Chris, myself, and Greg on the reshoring from China and some of the things that you want to take into consideration as you say, okay, we want to move out of China. Well, it's not that easy. Then these are 5 major areas. Of course, from a cost perspective, although China's labor costs have increased, still it's much less expensive to produce things in China than in the US. And now they're using automation on top of that. And they're doubling down to get to be that low cost supplier country globally. So just moving on to China makes it very difficult to be competitive from a global perspective. Of course, the supply chain disruption, moving manufacturing operations from China to another source, there will be disruptions in your supply chain. So there, you have to take that into consideration. And then of course, your skilled workforce availability. Well, now they're making your goods in China. Now you need to find a workforce to make those goods in your country of choice, whether it's North America, Africa, South America, it doesn't matter. You'll need a skilled workforce. And does it exist? And does that infrastructure exist? And then are the regulatory and compliance issues of the country that you're moving to, they're going to be different than China. And are you going to be able to be compliant in those? And then that infrastructure, just the four walls, the energy that you need to deal with in moving in that direction. So I'll open it up. Chris, your thoughts on reshoring from China, some of the things to take in consideration.
Well, there's definitely a lot of movement in that area. And one of the things, it's even one of the scenarios that you're going to see results from in just a minute. And that is that a lot of companies are quick to move their tier ones or attempt to move their tier one suppliers. Oh, let's reshore, let's bring those folks back, let's bring those companies closer. But the rest of the supply chain is still wherever it was, generally China. And so you've brought one part over, and that's that does help, but it only solves part of the problem. The real problem is that you've got a supply chain that is embedded in China. And that's what this scenario, the scenarios we're going to look at is exactly designed to sort of analyze and show the impact of when all those move around and the structure of the supply chain shifts significantly. What does that look like?
Yeah. China is still the central place for consolidation of goods before they're moved to North America or Europe. So even if you make it in Vietnam, let's say, at tier one, it will probably end up going back to go back up to China to get finally assembled. So
Yeah.
or shipped from a ship because it's the largest port in the world. So everything, has to go through Shanghai and the other ports in China from a consolidation of trade routes. So it's very intricate problem. I think we all look for simple solutions and find out that they're more complicated than we originally thought. Greg, your thoughts?
You bet. I'll just inject a couple of threads here. If you're thinking about doing this, it's going to require a very difficult and hard executive discussion. And that discussion has to be around three things: costs, benefits, and risk. No matter how large the scope of your change might be, I would say you're going to have some hard discussions about cost, benefits, and the risk. That would be my 2 cents.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. All right. With that, we'll move on. Do please enter any questions or comments anywhere, anytime during the webinar, and we'll inject them as best we can. The second area here was the impact of global trade maps, and we're going to let Greg lead us through the Middle East conflict imperils, another maritime trade route. Greg?
You bet. Thanks, Jim. We thought we'd begin our dialogue with a recent profile of the trade routes and their choke points from our friends at Pangea Risk. They're out of South Africa. We've been partners with them for about 5 or 8 years, and they look at conflicts and associated risk elements within the African arena and the Middle East. The legend for the graph is down on the bottom left, and let's just take a look at that. The heavy dark blue, those are basic core carrier routes. The light blue is a secondary route around the globe. The red circles are primary choke points, according to Pangea, and the orange circle are secondary choke points. And then on the bottom left, they go through a color coding ranking from low, which is green, to a score of quite high and severe as in terms of orange or red. So the net to us is there's substantial risks, folks. They're going to continue to loom over the global marketplace, suggesting to us ongoing volatility and uncertainty in all global supply chains. So it's not over. And with that, we wanted to move into give you a little additional insight into the next slide. So
Okay.
if you're taking a look at the McKinsey slide, we thought we'd take a deeper dive for you into this global supply chain shift, or you might want to call it reshoring concept, with the help of McKinsey's 2020 analysis report. They did a very deep dive. It's a great report as of 2020. We just pulled out 2 companies in 2 different sectors and wanted to just give you some insight on that. First, on the left is PepsiCo. We all know them. You can witness their supply chain complexity down in the graph. Hopefully yours isn't as complex as theirs. They call it a global. What does that mean? That means PepsiCo tends to think globally when they develop supply chains, but they press the issue of acting local. All right. Then McKinsey evaluated their feasibility to geographically shift their supply chains, and that is in the blue box above the PepsiCo statement. What did they do? They broke it down into economic and non-economic factors. You can take a look at them. The economic factors, the circle, that's quarter filled. What does that mean? That indicates that their business model, where you make, where you sell, and because 90% of the raw material is water, the feasibility of modifying is quite low, modifying their supply chain. From the non-economic point of view, their feasibility is almost non-existent. Why? Because local governments require they make the product in the country where they sell it for taxes and job purposes. On the right-hand side is Dell. We all know Dell. Their supply chain is super complex. You can take a look at that. From an economic feasibility point of view, the feasibility to shift supply chains can be made since they are assemblers, so they can move that around from an economic point of view. From a non-economic feasibility, it's possible to shift their supply chain, but a bit harder due to country requirements. So we just wanted to give you a sense of how McKinsey was looking at different industries and companies within different industries in their feasibility to actually do a geographical shift. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. I think we're having some screen share problems. I apologize. Hopefully you can see the screen now. With that, we're going to move to the third section. Hopefully you can see the screen now. I reset everything. Okay, Mark said he can see. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. With that, we'll look into a polling question on what type of risk events that you're seeing out there. And if you could respond on what risk you would like to see modeling, it would be great. We see we have some about China. We're going to cover mining, lithium, battery. The EV market is very interesting. Shortages. We're going to look at this in a few minutes, just at the end of this section. With that, Chris, it's all yours.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'm a huge fan of Venn diagrams, and so we have one right here that shows we're sort of at the intersection of looking the STO perspective, strategic, tactical, operational. So from a strategic view, that may be more abstract and long-term to this more detailed operational perspective. So there's that element. There's the strategic risk paradox at the top here that we looked at last time. That was the basis of the last webinar that says, hey, for the big strategic issues that have huge impacts, cost a lot of money if they happen, real severe impacts, those we tend to spend very little, they're 80% of the severity of things that could happen to us, but we spend less than 10% of our time on them. And instead we spend a lot of time on these operational issues, which really in the big picture don't have as huge of an impact. So there's that. And then last of all, simulation. With what I mentioned with scmBOX is this ability to do structural simulation. And so all those come together to sort of help us understand how we might be able to de-risk things, within this VUCA world that we now live in. And so that kind of sets the framework for this. So we're going to start building on, if you were in the last webinar, we're using the exact same model. So I'm just going to kind of cover that quickly, but we're extending what we did last time, where our focus last time was on looking at having, if you had a single sole source supplier, the issues with that, the risk associated with that, and adding a second supplier and how that alleviates that risk. And we looked at that, from a structural simulation standpoint. So the problem statement here, the setup is still the same. If you start with the graphic on the bottom, every company, every agent within this simulation receives raw material. They then store those raw materials. They're trying to all hold 4 weeks of raw materials. They then produce things that go into finished goods, hold 4 weeks of finished goods, and then they deliver. So that's kind of the make to stock model that that every organization, every supplier in this model will have. The base case that we're looking at is this smooth, steady state of 100 orders a week for a 2-year. The simulation is a 2-year simulation. We're only looking at, this is one SKU or SKU for a company. So when we say they're having issues with that, it doesn't mean the whole company's going broke or bankrupt and everything starting. It's just this one product line. And we're assuming no waste, in the sense that there's perfect yield. Everything that everyone makes in this model is all good. We don't have to deal with 10% waste or yield issues. So we're kind of picking a real simple example. We understand, but that's to be able to cover it quickly. The other thing I want to add, I mentioned the 4 weeks inventory, but the inventory control, the management feedback loops that sort of govern how quickly are we going to try to recover our raw material, our gaps in raw material and gaps in finished goods, is moderate. We'll say that it's not trying to aggressively go fill those gaps. So when I have a gap between the amount of raw material I would like to have and the amount I actually do have, I don't try to close that gap super fast. But then again, I'm not taking a real long time to close it. So if my gap is 100, I may order 25 or 30 or 50. I'm not trying to order all 100, because that can cause some overshoot impacts and being too aggressive and things like that. And, generally we want to know that this is a permanent change, so we're going to leave it there. So anyway, that kind of sets up the model. Now, what's different is that in the previous model, we had an OEM and a tier 1 supplier. Now what we're doing is adding a tier 2. So we have the OEM, we have a tier 1, and then we have 3 tier 2s. Now what's also different is, in the previous model, the tier 1 suppliers that we were considering were giving us the same thing. So we could move between those 2 suppliers and get the same product or the same component from them. Now this tier 1 has 3 different component manufacturers that all those things are needed to make something at that tier 1 level that then comes up to us. So it's slightly different. These are not equivalent suppliers. They're for 3 different components. And you'll see that there's numbers on each of these, the kind of flows. If we're doing 100 deliveries a week, you see deliveries on the right side of each of these graphics for each of these suppliers. 100 is the delivery pipeline is 100. I want 4 weeks of finished goods. So we see 400 in finished goods. There's 100 being produced every week. I want 400 raw materials, 4 weeks worth, and then 100 receiving. So that's kind of the smooth flow, and everyone has that. So this is our setup for what we're about to walk through. Now, what I'd like to do is now I'm going to compare. So previously, what we had in our U.S. based model at the time was this first column called previous U.S. model, where these are the financials. We sold things for $10 a unit. The material cost was $250. Shipping costs. Here's all the costs associated with that. And when you looked at 100 orders, 100 units a week being delivered and sold, the profit margin was 20%. So everything was kind of looking at that profit margin of 20%. Now we're saying, hey, we moved to China because it was cheaper. The material costs dropped by 20%, but our shipping costs increased a little bit. Now we got a bigger, longer route, and so that went up a little bit. But everything else we're saying is the same. But the net result is that at that same baseline, and we're going to call this the baseline China, our profit margin is now 25%. So we see that's one of the reasons we moved over there in that case. And so that's our now baseline. So when you hear me say baseline, I'm referring to that baseline in China. So the scenarios that we're going to go through now is we'll talk about the baseline one, simple enough. Then scenario one is the same as the baseline. We're going to keep that same structure, but we've got a diplomatic embargo with China, and for some, for whatever reasons, and so for 2 months, China's basically, you can't get anything out of China. So our tier one, we cannot get anything from the tier one. In scenario two, we're going to have moved our tier one over to the US. So that situation where our tier one moves over, the rest of the supply chain is still in China, but there's that same 2-month embargo. And so all those tier twos over in China are stopped for 2 months. Now, in parentheses, we're saying we're not going to cover the costs associated or the delays associated with moving and setting up a tier one in the US, because there's so many factors with that. And it does add, that is one additional cost to this in the near term, but too many options there, and we don't want the modeling and simulation to be about picking the wrong variables for how long there would be a delay for that or whatever. But I think the numbers we've used before is that it's roughly 6 months and $1 to $1.5 million or something to set a new supplier, get a new supplier up and going. Scenario three is our tier one is in the US, but now we've spread out our other component tier twos to other countries. We still have one of them in China, and again, there's the 2-month embargo, so we're going to check the impact there. And similar to scenario two, we're not going to cover the cost of the moves of those tier twos. And then scenario four is basically the same end result we got in the previous webinar, and that's where you have backup suppliers, you have secondary suppliers for all your tier two components, so that if one of them has issues, you can recover. And we're not going to show the results for that one, because what we saw in the previous webinar is that when you have that second supplier, there's no impact to the end customer. We have found that you're allowed to move and shift there. So I want to kind of back us up and start with the simulation results we got with the US baseline previously, and now we're going to move and show some other stuff. So the table here shows that in our previous baseline, the US based one, we're kind of keeping this variable called cash available as our money maker, and we made roughly a little over $120,000 and down lower our lead time. The longest lead time we ever had was a week, which is what we were set for. So that's great. All our deliveries were on time, and our minimum profit margin, the worst we ever had, is the 20%, because there was this steady state. So now we're going to talk about the baseline China. So here we are, we're the black box, we're the OEM, and over in China, the yellow box is our tier one, and you see the tier twos feeding into the tier one and then coming across to the US. So this is the setup, the structure of the supply chain for our baseline China. We look at the results for that, and this is a slide. These are all the results are always the OEM. We're not looking at tier ones and tier twos, although we could show those results, but they begin to get complicated in this short of a webinar. So we're just going to show results for the OEM, and that's us, and that's what we care about. So here, what we're looking at is raw materials, finished goods, and deliveries. And in the steady state, we see raw materials and finished goods just sitting there at 400 all the time, because every time I'm delivering or I'm moving 100, but 100 are coming in. So it's like a bathtub with equal water coming in and going out. It always stays the same. And so that's what raw material and finished goods at 400. And then our deliveries are down at 100. So in the steady state case, here's the situation. And the results of that steady state case, earlier we said we had a 25% profit margin, and here's where we see that. We now make a little bit more money. The lead time, again, is just 1 week because we're already set up. We're smooth flow. We've got that all set up. Everything's on time. Minimum profit margin of 25%. Perfect. So now we move into scenario one. So here's our 2-month embargo. So we're putting an X over our tier one supplier over there in China. We can't get anything from that supplier. So that's our setup. If we now look at the results of that 2-month embargo, what we see here, we're now looking at the same things: raw material, finished goods, and deliveries. And we see the raw materials, which is the the dark solid line, begin to drop. And we saw this in the last webinar, is, hey, when they go out, I'm now living off what I have. And so there's a period of time where I'm still surviving, but my raw material, I'm not getting any delivery. So my raw material drops. Then after a few more weeks, my finished goods drop. And in these cases, I get really, really close to running out, but I actually don't. And then they start picking up, and the onslaught of previous orders start coming in. And so we see this kind of overshoot with our raw material, and our finished goods gets back up to where we want it. And our deliveries, again, had suffered for a while, but build back up, and we over deliver for a while because we're making up for orders. And then we sort of settle down. So in this, at the end of the simulation, at the end of 2 years, we're settled back down with finished goods and deliveries, but our raw material is still kind of going a little crazy. And if we look at the results from that, here's where it gets interesting. So now our cash available has dropped significantly. So we lost some money there, 51,000. But this time to recover to get to half of our, 50% of our deliveries, so 50, being able to deliver 50 a week, took us 14 weeks. And it took us 20 weeks to get to fully able to deliver that 100%. And again, we kind of overshot that because we're making up for previous ones, and then we settled back down. The highest and lowest spikes in our raw material and finished goods inventory. This is interesting because you want to see how volatile the situation is. So the highest spike, if you remember from that chart, we saw raw material go up pretty high, 164% above what we were holding at 400. So way up there. And we dropped to negative 96%. So we only had 4% for a while there. So we didn't run out, but we came pretty close. If we look at finished goods, we never overshot. We just always kind of built back up to that. But again, we dropped to negative 96. We were very, very close to running out. Here's an interesting one, is that our orders backlog, we got to, that build. So when we're not delivering, orders are still coming in, and that backlog of orders built to over 1,150% above the normal, above the steady state. So way up there. One thing we're not accounting for is that a lot of those folks would walk away. And so we're not including that in the model. In the model, we assume that you're able to recover all those. But in the real world, you probably lose some of those. So the financial impact would be worse than what we're seeing. You can see with the longest lead time, it now went from 1 week to 12 weeks. So there was a period of time, the worst that we had, where it took us 12 weeks to satisfy an order. We only had 61% on-time deliveries because a period of time we weren't able to make that 1 week delivery window, and we stretched up to 12 weeks, and then we finally got back to smooth flow again. But we missed almost 40% of our orders, and our minimum profit margin. So at one point we dipped to over negative 550%. So pretty bad dip. So let's look at so that's scenario one. If we now look at scenario two, this is the situation where we have our tier one over in the US, but all the others, all the tier twos are still sitting over in China, and there's the 2-month embargo over there. So now we're having issues with our tier two, not our tier one, tier two. So if we look at results now, from that, again, it's the same. It's the OEM, it's raw materials, finished goods, delivery, same what we saw in the chart before. Just a quick look, it's not as bad as it was before, because now we have a tier one that's in the US, and we have that additional layer of inventory and finished goods to sort of help us out. So we still see the same drop eventually. It's a little later in the simulation, but we see the raw material drop. That's the solid line. We see the dashed line, the finished goods. We buy ourselves a little more time because we have this raw material already that's going through, buys us another 4 weeks or so, and then that begins to drop. And our deliveries make it for a while, and then they drop, and then we have some kickback. But notice this isn't as bad as the previous one because we have that buffer of the tier one being here in the United States. And if we look at the table and we look at the actual results at the end of that simulation, we see that our cash available compared to the 126,000 in the baseline China example. Now in scenario 2, we're sitting at 113,000, so did better. It takes us 3 weeks to recover to the 50% of our deliveries as compared to 14 weeks in scenario 1. It takes us 7 weeks to recover to 100% compared to 20 weeks in scenario 1. Our spikes are, the high spike is not as high with the raw material, only a plus 75%, but we still drop to the negative 96%, so we get very close to running out. On finished goods, we drop to negative 90%, so close, but not as close. Our highest orders backlog spike now is only 288%. So we still don't like that, and we would still probably lose some of those orders in the real world, but it's not near as bad as the previous scenario. So at least bringing the tier one over to the U.S. helps because we have this additional layer of the supply chain in the U.S. The longest lead time is 4 weeks. Go ahead.
Yeah, just there's a question in the chat here of the embargo, the 2-month embargo, and where the raw material line starts to go up relative to that, and what drives the overall delivery of raw materials in both of these scenarios.
Okay, so the over delivery is going to be, so yeah, let's just pick one of these. So just like if you see, let's pretend like, so we are the OEM, and if you look at our delivery, so I'll come back and address the raw materials in just a second, but if we look at our deliveries here, when we are unable to deliver and our deliveries drop, our order backlog, we still have all these orders that need to be fulfilled. So for a while, we're going to overshoot on our deliveries above the 100 steady state because we have to make up for all those, and then we'll settle back down on 100. So Jim's following that with his cursor right now. So those are all due to backlogs of orders. So the same thing happens with raw material. We're ordering raw material, and those orders for raw material are there, and then they get over delivered to us to make up for that. Well, then when they're over delivered, we're sort of changing. It begins to change when we're trying to control our inventory. It begins to change how much we need to order. And so we see some oscillation, very much the bullwhip effect kind of things happening where there's a bit of it's not over ordering like I ordered too much. It's that everything's trying to catch up and there are delays in the system. And so that's how you end up with this over delivery. And when you say when the two, you're asking when it's lifted.
Yeah,
it's not exactly because there are delays in this system. Remember, I've got finished goods that can immediately go out, and it's my raw materials that take a while to kind of make it through production and get delivered out. So the embargo, when the lines start to go up, is actually after the embargo, a little bit after the embargo. Because there's a little bit of a delay. So Mark, I hope that answered your questions there. But if we move on back, so we're looking at the results from scenario 2. So a little bit better, and we're down to the longest lead time of 4 weeks compared to 12 weeks. So again, having at least the tier 1 over in the US helps some. Our on-time deliveries are up to 84%, and the worst profit margin that we suffer now is a negative 44%. So at least bringing the tier 1 over shows vast improvement compared to having everything over in China. But that's not the full story because there's the rest of the supply chain, the tier 2. So we move into scenario 3, and here's the map, kind of using that same map before and showing that, well, we've got the tier 1 in the US, but now we brought we've spread out our tier 2s to other countries, Mexico, Africa, but we still have one that's sitting over in China, and again, suffers the 2-month embargo. So we're showing that the same 2-month embargo in China, depending on the structure of your supply chain, has different impacts. So now when we look at the results from that, well, remember, we're not going to see a huge improvement because I need all of these components to make all these, the 3 tier 2 components all come together to our tier 1 to be made into one system or component that's going to go up to come to us. So it doesn't improve everything because I still have one of those components that I need that is having trouble. However, there's a slight improvement, but this looks a lot like the previous scenario, with a dip in the raw material, dip in the finished goods, a little bit of overshoot and oscillation, a little bit of over delivery, but we settled back down, again to the kind of the finished goods at 400 and the deliveries at 100. And when we look at those results, we see even more improvement. We see that we got up to 119,000, so we're getting closer to what we had in China, but realize, of course, that the costs have changed a little bit. So we the reason we went to China in the first place in this example was to get lower costs. So that's not happening as much now, but we're getting close to the 120 that we saw in the U.S. based. That's what we want to compare against because the cost structure there is the same. So we're getting close to that 120. The recovery times have also dropped. So 2 weeks to get to 50%, 4 weeks to get to 100% of our deliveries. Our spikes were roughly the same, except for that finished goods didn't dip as much. And then the highest order backlog is now only 150%. So chances are we're not losing too many customers. At that point, the longest lead time is 2.5 weeks. So we've shrunk that lead time. Our goal is a week, and when we're in steady state, it's a week. But in this case, in this period of disruption, the worst we had was 2.5 weeks. Our on-time deliveries, slightly better, 85%, but the minimum profit margin, the worst it got was negative 26%. So all these factors are getting better and better with scenario 3. We mentioned this, we're not going to show results from it, but the next slide shows scenario 4, where we have doubled up on all our tier 2 suppliers. So if one of them has issues, we can shift some our orders to other suppliers. And we showed in the first webinar that overcame the issues. You might have a little bit of oscillations, but in the end, you're all right. So if we look at now what we're going to do is compare all the results. So we're not looking at scenario 4. We know that's the best scenario. We showed that already. But now what we're going to do is look at raw materials for each of the simulations on one chart. Then we'll look at finished goods and delivery. So these are all the scenarios, just the raw material, and we're seeing the difference now. And so the baseline is that straight black dark line that goes straight across. We never deviate from 400, 4 weeks, 100 orders a week. 400 is what we want. You'll see that in scenario 1, that's where our tier 1 is in China, and that one there's an embargo. We drop immediately because that's the tier 1 sending to us, and so we immediately start losing our raw material, and we're only living off what we have. So we dip down and we get really close to running out, but we somehow recover. But it's a little bit longer of a recovery, and so there's an overshoot of that raw material to make up for those past orders. If we look at scenario 2, which is now our solid green line, we see it dip, and all of these roughly dip to the negative 96%. So we're all very close to running out, but we don't. But you'll notice that the drop occurs much later because we have the buffer of our tier 1, our US tier 1 supplier. We've got all that inventory there also that helps us. We essentially have 400 in finished goods and 400 raw material that could still come to us. So that's another 800, 8 weeks worth that still come from us. So here we see that we can make it a little bit longer. And same with scenario 3. So those kind of line up there a little bit off, and there's a little benefit. There's some benefit to spreading out our suppliers here. So that's the raw material. If we then go look at finished goods, we see something sort of similar where the impact in scenario 1, which is our tier 1 is in China and is shut down for 2 months. We see the impact immediately because we have to now start living off our own finished goods. That's all we've got. But we buy a little bit of time with scenarios 2 and 3 when we have a US-based tier 1, and we see dips, and we see that the finished good dips are not as bad in each of these successive scenarios. And in all of them, we come back up, and you'll see with scenarios 2 and 3, their dips are rather short. We dip, but we come back pretty quickly. And we saw that with our ability to recover to 50% and 100% of our deliveries. If we now look at deliveries, similarly, scenario 1 is our worst case. We start dropping immediately because we're living off our own finished goods and raw material. And so we drop. We over deliver to make up for that, and then we're settled back down by the end. Scenarios 2 and 3 are the other ones in there. The dotted blue line is scenario 3, the solid green line is scenario 2. And we see those dip and come back, and they're a little bit, but they're much shorter and not as extensive and as chaotic. So those are now the deliveries of all of them. But what we haven't looked at yet, we talked about profit margin. So now on this slide is profit margin. And there's a lot going on here, but start with the baseline, 25%, just going across. I'd have no deviation, so I'm just sitting there at 25%. Then what we see is that in scenario 1, we start at 25%. Our margin actually goes up for just a little bit because we're depleting our raw materials, right? So when that is factored into our cost, we're not holding as much. The inventory cost goes down, makes us look better. But then we're hit, of course, and that thing drops precipitously down to negative 588%. Then kind of comes back up. And any of these oscillations you see in the profit margin are due to the oscillations in raw materials and finished goods inventory because and the deliveries, because we're making money when we deliver and we're holding all these different costs. So that's why we see some oscillations. Scenario 2 is the green line. You see it dip down at its worst at negative 44%. You see the blue dotted line, scenario 3, a little less than that at negative 26%. But you'll notice in each of those, they started at a point at 20%, not 25, because we had the change in cost by moving over to the US. So that's looking there. The last slide is our sort of, it all comes down to the bottom line. So how much money are we making? And your baseline situation, the China baseline is 120 by the end. We started with 100,000, we built up, and by the end we had 126. But you'll see on scenario 1, we actually, when we start getting hit by this, we actually we lose money. So we not only, we didn't make as much, but we actually lost because we're below the 100,000 that we started at. So we're down to 51, we're losing money. And that would eventually probably recover, but we didn't run, simulation is a longer simulation. Scenario 2 is a little bit better. We get up to 113. Scenario 3, better, up to 119. And again, that 119 is really a comparison to the US 120,000 that we saw in the baseline. But this is putting it against the Chinese, the baseline if everything was in China. And so now we see the financial impact of all of those occurring as well. So Jim, I'll let you get back to.
Yeah, just a question here that's I see coming in, and that is, between scenario 2 and 3, there's relatively little difference. And the question is the work of moving, the cost of moving suppliers that's involved in 3 versus 2. From what I recall, is substantially different. So are you taking into account the cost of moving suppliers in this calculation? Or is it?
We said that up front, is that there's the whole different, we're not including any of the costs of moving any of these suppliers because that's a whole issue in and of itself. And we didn't want to get into sort of the argument of, well, it takes 6 months. No, it only takes 4 months. It costs $5 million. It only costs $2 million.
Sure.
So we're taking the movement out and we're just looking at kind of the structure and how that structure performs. And now the difference, you see a slight difference. You don't see a perfect if you still have, what we're showing is that there are steps to getting better. The best situation is to have all your tier 2 suppliers, all your suppliers sort of spread out geographically, and also doubled up on your critical ones. In this case, we could pretend they're all critical, and we're suggesting, you'd want second suppliers with all those. And there's additional money associated with that. I completely agree. But what Greg mentioned earlier is there's a risk element to this in everything you do. And so, I mean, we all pay insurance for our cars and our houses and everything. It's the same kind of situation. The investment is made to prevent the worst from happening. And we've seen the worst has now happened plenty of times, and we've all gotten stuck with that. And so the idea here is we're showing us kind of a stepwise approach of nearshoring, and that just bringing the tier 1 over isn't enough.
Yeah. And I think what I'm trying to get at is if you're sitting in the boardroom with all the folks and you have this information, obviously they're going to ask the question around scenario 2 and 3, and is it really worth, and then what is the rate at which we should be changing up suppliers, which suppliers, but that's the conversation that you're trying to get them to have, is the point that I'm really trying to make here.
And we can bring that into the simulation. We're just trying to keep it simple and short so we
Right.
could make a webinar, kind of
Sure,
focus. Yeah.
but we're trying to lead up to real world situations of conversations, right? So that's
Right.
where I was trying to get at. So I think it's a really good exercise to show the impact. We ask, if understanding that these models can get very complex, as Chris said, we welcome your thoughts on either today or tomorrow or the next day, so to speak, on what you would like to see modeled and what you think your leadership would want to be modeling would be fantastic to get that feedback so we can make these webinars. We try to make them simple because obviously we could sit here for 2 or 3 hours to go through all the different scenarios and the details. But any added thoughts, Greg?
No, I think Chris went through a lot of cause and effect, and that's I think what we're trying to get across is the issue of cost, benefits, and risk. So all the best with it.
Yeah. So please do let us know, let Chris know, reach out if you have questions or ideas. With that, we'll go into the recommendations to address the impact. Chris will take us through this. Chris?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the biggest things is relying on, these suppliers they're geographically distant, far away in the world. There's the global this global aspect of supply chains, and the globalization has increased, and so suppliers are further and further away, and that just increased risks significantly. While they're in a simple steady state situation, the cost may be lowest in those scenarios. We're sort of advocating that cost is not the only consideration. You can see that when there are disruptions, as we showed with recovery times and the overshoot and the chaos of recovering, that it's the further away they are, the more difficult though that is, and the more chaotic it is. The closer they are, they're a little more controlled. You have tiers of your supply chain that are in the U.S., and so they become buffers to buffer you from some of those disruptions, even if you have a disruption further in the chain. But by and large, the geographically, the companies, your suppliers that are far away, can have disastrous effects and increase your risk significantly. And so what we're showing in this simulation is if you were to diversify and kind of move those around, you have less risk and even better performance. The second note is that these kinds of structural issues can be analyzed with really little or no actual data. So you'll notice that we just used hypothetical. So it's always easy to run 100 orders and deliveries through, and let's do everything based on 100 in relative. And what we find is whether it was the true number is 100 or 72 or 1,017, it doesn't matter. It's relative. The performance that we can show in these structural simulations is relative to that. So when we say it's a 500% overshoot, that 500% overshoot occurs whether it was at 100 or 1,000 or whatever. It's all proportional. But it allows you to now look at these solutions, these possible scenarios before they arise, because I don't need data. I don't need data from the situation to actually begin to look to see which performance is better. So in our little example with just some hypothetical data, we were already able to see which supply chains performed better. Now, I'm not saying data is not important. As data is available, you add that to the model, and it just makes the model more refined to get there. So data is important. The next is that these this kind of modeling and simulation, the structural modeling and simulation, and when we're looking at strategic risks and issues, these play out over long periods of time, months, years. Here we are running a 2-year simulation. You could see that some things in some of the like the raw material hadn't quite settled down yet. So this thing plays out even longer, 3 or 4 years. So these kinds of models play out, they're designed to look at long-term strategic issues, whereas the current network optimization tools that are out there are really only capable of looking at steady state situations, not the transition between any of those steady state situations, and they're relatively short term in the sense that you're looking at days, weeks, months, something like that, but they're really not the technology. And that's a whole other subject that we'll do in another webinar, is the technology itself is not conducive to the long-term strategic analyses. Last is, you can see from this, no company is an island. It's a system, and you are one part in that system, and the decisions and actions of all the companies and the suppliers in the system greatly impact everyone else. And even though I may be forecasting what I think I'm going to do the next month, that forecast is irrelevant if I've got issues in my supply chain, and my other suppliers are having issues, and that's going to impact me. So that's kind of the end all.
Thanks, Chris. So just going back to the agenda, hitting the last section here on how do we get started, Chris?
Yeah, let me hop back on here. And it starts with a supply chain readiness assessment, which is free from Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. They have that for free available, and kind of understand what your supply chain looks like. Then you're mapping end to end. And when I say end to end, I mean top to bottom. Let's get down to, tier N. In most industries, if the bill of material will define what that supply chain looks like, it often mirrors, the supply chain mirrors the bill of material. So then you're identifying what your strategic risks and issues are, which we just took the nearshoring, offshoring example. But what do you want to look at? Now we can do these structural simulations to understand the supply chain as a system, top to bottom, how it reacts. And in the end, what you're creating is this playbook of responses of, if X happens, I'm going to do Y. If A happens, I'm going to do B. And now we're just watching the environment and watching to see when we get to the situation, X or A, and then we have a playbook we're ready to go with our solution. So that's how that plays out.
Greg?
Yep, you bet. As Chris mentioned, one possible starting point is our supply chain management readiness assessment. I think you get the thread that supply chains are shifting around the globe. And so essentially this is, as Chris mentioned, a free assessment of your supply chain processes. You take a look at the chart. The chart is the outcome of the assessment questions. There are 13 tenets. You can take a look at them around the clock. The blue are strategic, the red are tactical, and the green are operational. What does it measure? It measures your supply chain process maturity and the inherent risks within those processes. So the closer to the center you are, the more mature that process is, and the less risk you have. Conversely, the farther away you are from the center, the less mature and the more risk. The black line is indicative of the answers from a company on the 92 questions for each of the processes. So we like the tool. It's free. The link is up in the red box. It starts the dialogue, folks, to talk about where are you on your supply chain maturity model? How mature are your supply chain processes? And again, it's free, so we feel it's a pretty good starting point with you and or your team and your peers. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. And just to tie it all together, Chris brought up quite a number of metrics there. We had customer delivery, margins, and the like, cash flow. So what we would encourage you to do is to look at where are you at today and where do you want to be tomorrow. These are benchmarks from our friends at Gartner, Chainalytics, and Hackett Group. And these are standard metrics, and these are what you can gain from understanding where you're at today with the supply chain management readiness assessment, and what you can gain by doing these type of activities, as Chris has shown, to make your supply chain more robust. So again, there's many more metrics that you can look at, but these best align to this China case study and what you would want to be looking at in the future. So again, we would encourage you to look at the risk impact and the impact to your bottom line through these metrics. And we can work with you on guiding you through other metrics also. With that, we want to thank you for joining the webinar, Reshoring from China. And hopefully we address these deliverables, giving you some insights of that impact on the supply chain trade routes, the financial impact of reshoring in different stages, different permutations to reset your supply chain to make it more risk averse to these type of risk events, and come up with a proactive planning approach to address that so you can have that meaningful discussion with your senior executives. Again, thank you for your time. We appreciate your questions, and please do follow up with us at any time. We are having the next webinar on financial health, and that should be very interesting, looking at losing a third tier or up to a third tier supplier. And with that, closing comments, Greg.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Jim. Hope we provided a few insights on this complex issue of global supply chain shifts. It requires a difficult executive discussion covering costs, benefits, and risks, especially understanding your company's risk appetite. Very, very important. With that, I'll thank you again for attending and all the best in your journey.
Thanks, Greg. Chris, closing comments?
Yeah, the simulations we ran, the scenarios we considered may not be exactly what your company may be looking at or considering. More the point is that it is now possible with structural simulation to look at these kinds of big picture, long-term supply chain structure issues and actually do some analysis. So you can see hopefully from this is that we could really handle a lot of other things. This just was a very simplified version, but it's now possible to do these kinds of analysis to really understand benefits or the things, all the operational impacts of reshoring.
Thanks, Chris. Fantastic tool. I love this first of a kind type of tool to look at these type of risk events and the impact to your bottom line. There's generally a lot of discussion, heated discussion when these events occur at the boardroom. I've sat in the room when these happen, and some say it'll never happen again, and others say if it did happen, what's the impact? What could happen? Well, now you can look at it by your SKUs, by your product lines, which product lines are more at risk than other product lines. There's such a multitude of opportunity here to really understand the risks that are inherent in your supply chain, especially with all these geopolitical tensions that keep occurring, and we don't see that slowing down anytime soon. So why not be proactive and not reactive? And so with that, I'll close it out. Thank you for joining, and we hope you have a great day and week ahead.
Thanks.